So the second exam is going to open on Thursday morning of this week. So that's in 2 days. And that's, April 28th. Today's the 26th. And then it'll be open for 4 days through Sunday. The fourth writing assignment is the last thing that'll be due, and that's due the following Sunday. So you'll have sort of the whole first week of finals week to get that one done. Just as an update, the final attendance grades will be uploaded to Blackboard later this week. You had like a grade up there that was from through the first 8 weeks of class, and that was actually what you saw. There was like a percentage, so it was out of 100%, but it's actually total attendance grades are worth 70 points. So it kind of looked like it was worth more of your grade than it really is, but that's still 7% of your grade. And so obviously want to make sure you get those points, and also once those grades are uploaded, please feel free to email if you have questions about it or anything else. And now is a good time to pause for questions. So are there any questions about anything as we are sort of wrapping up? Let's see here. All right, so one thing I wanted to demonstrate really quickly for those of you working on the fourth writing assignment is that, so you have to include at least 5 references in the paper. And if you use Google Scholar to do your searching, so sometimes, you'll get taken to links like this. And this is, by the way, where you'll find the DOI. It can just be like a web address like this, that it'll have DOI listed. And typically, you're not gonna be able to access the articles from the journal publisher website. So sometimes, if I were to just search this article so I can find it in a more normal way. So this one, I would have to access through the UH library website if I wanted to access it. But what I was trying to demonstrate here is just that there's a button on Google Scholar that allows you to cite articles in APA format. And it doesn't do it perfectly in APA format, but it gets you pretty close. And so it's worth at least starting there for your citations. And that way you don't have to kind of do it all from scratch. So when you click this little cite button next to any article, which it'll show up for, you just go, there's different types of formatting for citations, and you just want to obviously highlight the APA formatting because that's what we use in this class. So you could just copy that and paste it into your reference list. And also it is slightly incomplete, and sometimes there's minor typo, or not typos, but just capitalization issues and things like that. So you do need to kind of double check it, but again, that will save you a little bit of time. So that's what I wanted to share. Okay. So I should probably go through, let's do the outline for today. First, so this chapter is about generalization, which means basically you're generalizing the results of a study to other populations, cultures, and settings. We'll talk about kind of all different types of generalization issues, including when you have other experimenters lead a study, the importance of replications, which we've talked about already in this class, and then different types of literature reviews. We'll take a break when we finish the content for chapter 14, and then we'll end class with 4 take-home messages. So that's kind of just things that I hope you remember from this class. Some of them are fairly basic things, like the difference between an experiment and a correlational study. But then some other things as well. So this is what we have to do today. To start out just by reviewing. So last week we talked about inferential statistics, and kind of the sole idea for inferential statistics is based on the fact that researchers don't really have access to entire populations to run studies. So instead you have to kind of collect a sample of people and then generalize to the population. And so inferential statistics are a type of statistics that are used to determine whether or not you can essentially generalize findings from a sample to reflect a true effect in the population. So if you remember last week, we saw this little diagram here, which is where you have a population of people, you sample from them, meaning you get a smaller number of them. Descriptive statistics, which is what we talked about 2 weeks ago, really focuses on just describing what you find in the sample and not necessarily trying to make this sort of leap back to the population, whereas inferential statistics does. And we talked a lot about like statistical significance last week and how inferential statistics kind of gives you information about that, and whether or not, if a finding is statistically significant, that typically means that the findings should reflect a true effect in the population. But really importantly, inferential statistics are just statistics, and they don't think for themselves per se. So there's a whole host of other things that could affect whether or not a study's results will generalize. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So we've seen this term before. We've talked about the difference between internal and external validity, and we talked about lots of other types of validity as well. But external validity, think like external to our study, do our findings generalize? And so that could be different sorts of settings, different periods of time, different groups of people, different places. So that there's all different ways in which you maybe would want to generalize findings of a study. And external validity basically just describes that. Does anyone remember what was internal validity? What does that have to do with again?
How much there's like a relationship between the dependent variable and independent variable, like how much they affect each other.
So the question I'm asking again is, what is internal validity? If this is what external validity is, what does internal validity refer to? It's kind of like that, how much there is a relationship between the variables, the validity of the experimental methods. Those are both kind of close answers. I'm looking for sort of two words connected with and. So typically, internal validity is most relevant to experimental methods, which focus on manipulating a variable to study Yeah, good job, Gabrielle. So yeah, cause and effect. That's internal validity. Like within a study, does your kind of independent variable truly cause changes in your dependent variable? So those are the two main types of validity. And sometimes we'll talk about it later. Like sometimes there are sort of trade-offs between those two types. So the first thing to sort of talk about with psychology research, which is the focus really for obviously this class and the research methods that we're talking about, is that they do, in general, I would say psychology research definitely sort of over relies on college student samples. And it's primarily because they're the most sort of convenient population to get to participate in studies. So there's like a psychology subject pool at most universities, and that's where a lot of research participants are recruited. So it is important to also acknowledge that like college students are not, they do not necessarily represent the population. They're certainly like in general, like restricted, meaning that there's like a more narrow range of ages reflected in college students. Generally speaking, kind of socioeconomic status, that's what SES stands for. So college students tend to be from higher socioeconomic statuses. And of course, given that everyone is attending college, they at least have completed some college if they're a college student. And so that puts them sort of at the top, certainly in the top half in terms of educational attainment in the US population. They also, generally speaking, college students tend to have higher cognitive skills, and they're more homogenous. So they're kind of more similar to each other than are adults in the general population similar to each other. So college students are, again, like sort of a restricted group of people. And so basically it's easy to criticize psychology sort of for over relying on college student samples. And I think it should be criticized to some extent because there are too many college student samples, but generally speaking, I think there's kind of a recognition that you can't solely rely on college student samples. And it's also sometimes like it's fine to have college student samples because the results would generalize. It depends on sort of what you're studying. So I guess in defense of college students, the book gives a few reasons why it's okay to rely a lot on college students as research participants. But first one is fairly obvious here, but college students are human, meaning that if you're trying to generalize to other humans, you're getting humans. And in terms of like certain like bodily functions and like how the brain works and things like that, where if you're studying really basic phenomena and that all humans kind of have in some sort of way, then college students can be a totally fine population. They're increasingly diverse. Certainly that's true in Houston, and that's in terms of like both race and ethnicity and also age. So I think University of Houston also is a good example of a school with not just sort of traditional college age students in terms of like early 20s, but there's people from all different periods of the lifespan. And as a really important sort of tool to not over rely on the results from a single study, we have replication procedures. And so a lot of articles that are published that use college student samples report data from more than one sample because they're sort of relatively easy to collect. You're sort of required or expected to at least include like 2 samples of college students. And that there are advantages in terms of like the accumulation of knowledge on a particular topic of collecting data from lots and lots of samples of college students rather than just collecting less data from non-college students. But in general, yeah, it's just something to be aware of. And especially like when you hear studies results reported in the media, or if you're reading about them, like sometimes the generalization from college students to the broader population can be a bit of a leap, but oftentimes it's okay. Another really important limitation of a lot of psychology research is that, and this would really sort of apply to any sort of human subjects research where you have to ask people to participate, and ethics does sort of require that. So when you go through the human resource or human subjects review board, when you have to submit like what's called an institutional review board application to get a study approved to run, basically you're not allowed to like make it mandatory to participate in research ever. And it's also sort of even problematic if you make it like too enticing so that people like are sort of unintentionally required to participate because they can't turn down such a great offer. So we need to rely on volunteers, and ultimately volunteers do differ in some ways from people who don't volunteer to participate in research. Generally speaking, volunteers tend to be more highly educated, of higher socioeconomic status, sort of more in need of others' approval, and they also tend to be more social. Sometimes in some of the studies that I've run, we have a hard time, especially recruiting men to participate in research. And so I think it's from at least like the few studies I've done, there's fairly conclusive evidence that volunteers are more likely to be women. And so that means that like we get like almost in some of the studies, like almost 3 women to volunteer for every 1 man. So that can be problematic in terms of generalizing to men the results of a study, and you have to sort of do extra statistical procedures to make sure that if there are gender differences in a particular variable, that you're accounting for those. And then the same sort of general principle would apply to just online research in general. So it's increasingly the case that like most people have some internet access and browse the web like regularly, at least to check email and things like that. But most is not everyone. And so certainly there's still lots and lots of people who do not access the internet, or maybe just do so in super limited amounts. So this is a problem, by the way, that also like is affected in polling for elections. So there's especially like in 2016, there's all this talk about how the polls were wrong, and I think they were wrong in the presidential election of 2022. They were less off anyway, but the whole sort of issue is like you're trying to get a representative sample of people who are going to actually vote on election day, and it's in some ways it's basically impossible to do that because a lot of people themselves don't even necessarily know if they're going to vote, or so a lot of like huge sort of chunks of the population are not either going to answer phone calls from a random number, or they're not going to respond to surveys they get sent on the internet, or they just don't have internet access. And so that's why it can be just really challenging to truly get like a representative sample of the population. But we can still sort of just generally speaking do our best, and that's what researchers do. So another sort of big generalization issue is across sex, gender, race, and generally speaking, people's identities. And we know all these variables are important, and they can impact how people behave, both in research studies and in the real world. The terms sex and gender are sometimes used interchangeably, but they do have different meanings. And so sex is generally speaking refers to like a biological classification of male or female. And then gender is more of a social identity that kind of is how people choose to identify, and that generally speaking is associated with sort of like male and female gender roles, and how people kind of conform to those. And also like gender doesn't have to be necessarily like a strict binary, but something that is more of a continuum. There's a ton of research in psychology on sex differences and gender differences in different variables. I would say it sort of like depends on the variable, how big of the gender differences there are. So actually in my field of research, one of the things I study are career interests, and there are fairly large gender differences in career interests, at least in some different sorts of careers. But that's sort of like one of the biggest gender differences that exist in all of psychological variables. So I would say it's safe to say that, yeah, in most psychological variables, there are relatively small gender and sex differences. So race is kind of can be a more complicated thing to assess. Just oftentimes maybe people have multiple racial identities, and there's also the sort of independent concept of ethnicity, which is used by the census in addition to race. And so there are also there can certainly be race and ethnicity differences in psychological variables, and it's important, yeah, to generally speaking, like as one way of showing that a sample is representative, to get people who identify from different races and ethnicities, and sort of you can always compare the percentages in your sample to those in the broader US population, which would be reflected in the census. So location and culture, there's a whole field of psychology that is really just focused on like cultural psychology, or how human behavior and other sort of norms and how people think and feel, how that differs across cultures. So I would say, yeah, too much research basically is focused on what are called weird cultures, which weird is just an acronym for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic cultures. So that often sort of refers to like the US, Canada, and like Western Europe, where there's a lot of, I don't know, I'd say that, too many participants of samples from those countries, and not enough in terms of, especially like Africa, there's not as much psychological research, and certain places in Asia as well. And it's certainly important to study differences across cultures, because sometimes, yeah, like people, depending on their cultural identity and how they've been raised and what's valued within their culture, they might respond differently to the same environments. And so again, this is just a really important question of generalizability. Do findings exist across cultures? And I think it's also important just to note that there really are a lot of similarities across cultures as well. And so evolutionary psychology, so evolutionary psychologists are sort of focused on understanding the role of evolution in people's current behaviors. And one of the main things in which they focus on to see whether or not something was likely an evolved psychological trait is whether or not it is sort of universal across cultures. And if it's not, then that would be more likely that like it was sort of a socially evolved phenomenon that exists only in certain cultures. So another generalization issue is across research methods. So we did an activity in class a few weeks ago, basically, where you were asked to sort of think about how you could test a research question using multiple, like two distinct research methods. And so that's always super important, that if there truly is like some relationship between variables, or that one variable causes another in the real world, you should be able to see that through multiple types of research studies. And that would include like an experiment, a correlational study, which might be like a survey or use of archival data. You should also be able to see it through like an observational research method. If you're doing like an experiment or something that involves like having a researcher like run participants through like a set of protocols in a lab, or it could be in the real world as well, it could be a problem in terms of generalization, just because that experimenter might be sort of doing something that's like idiosyncratic or unique, and it might like influence participants in some unexpected way. And so one way of sort of controlling for this anyway is just sort of only having one experimenter, and that at least means that like every research participant is for the most part going to get like the same version of an experimenter when they go through the study. Of course, like it maybe depends on like how tired that experimenter is one day. Maybe one day they don't do as good of a job as another day, but at least you're sort of, generally speaking, sort of controlling for it when you only have one person. However, yeah, sometimes, and this is one of the sort of the big debates that's existed in psychology because of that replication crisis, which I sort of talked about, where in sort of like, I think it was in like 2012 or around then, there was this big study that showed that only like a third of psychology research studies from particular like fields replicated. And so people were like arguing, well, maybe it was because the new experimenters who were running the studies like differed from the original ones in important ways. And that could be because of their personality, their gender, how much experience they have with research and running participants through studies. And other people sort of argued that like if the findings of studies are so dependent and like they're so fragile that you need to have like only one experimenter go through something, then like it's probably not all that important of a finding, or not necessarily very robust, and would be less likely to sort of generalize to the real world. And I think that's sort of the perspective that I have too, that like you want to sort of study things that truly there is a relationship there, and it shouldn't matter that much who the experimenter is, as long as they're trained and kind of going through a set of protocols. So you can also sort of set up a study where you have two or more experimenters, and you maybe would control for that, or at least make sure that like there aren't big differences across experimenters in your study. All right, so we're moving along. We've got like 8 more slides, and then we'll take the break, and we'll end take-home messages, like I said. So just wanted to give everyone a sense of where we're at here. Another important generalization issue is the use of a pretest, and this is in an experimental study where this is most often relevant, where we talked about this when we're going through experimental methods, how like when you're setting up an experiment, you always have some sort of a manipulation. And so that's what we see here in terms of administering a treatment. And you want to see the effects of this treatment on some sort of outcome variable. And so that's typically what you assess in the post-test. And oftentimes researchers sort of have a choice of whether or not they want to administer a pretest to see sort of how the outcome variable was like before any treatment. And so there are a couple of advantages from a generalizability standpoint of doing a pretest. And one thing is that it just helps you assess that like if you have two groups, or if you just have one group, that like that group is equivalent to the broader population in terms of like the mean scores on a particular variable. It also helps you assess what are called mortality effects, which doesn't mean like dying necessarily. In this context, it means like you drop out from a study. So attrition is also a word where you can see that if people who scored higher or lower on your sort of dependent variable at the pretest are more likely to drop out from the study. And if they do, then that would be an important thing to control for. However, a big disadvantage of a pretest from a generalizability standpoint is that you may sort of lose the ability to generalize to populations that did not receive a pretest. And this would sort of just be the case in any circumstance where like you're worried as a researcher that just taking a pretest might influence people in some sort of way. And so that could be the case if it's like an intervention designed to reduce smoking, which is something that we've talked about, and sometimes just like having people keep track of how much they smoke every day and write it down, like that can actually influence their behavior because they're not typically doing that. So this is another sort of review concept, but we talked about this particular type of design called the Solomon 4-group design, which is basically the 4 groups, so in sort of set up in 2 subgroups where you have an experimental group and a control group, and then you have half the participants in each of the experimental and control group take the pretest and half don't take the pretest. And so that way you have like 2 out of the 4 groups are only receiving the post-test, and 2 out of the 4 groups are receiving both the pre-test and the post-test. And that helps you assess whether or not you can generalize to people who did not receive the pre-test. So I would say from my perspective, this is probably one of the worst problems with psychology research generalizing, is the sort of over-reliance on lab studies to conduct experiments. And so the reason psychologists use lab settings is that you have full control over sort of what happens in a lab, and that you bring a research participant in, you've already set up the sort of room exactly the way you want it. There's an experimenter who's trained and knows what they're doing, and there's like relatively little can go wrong. Of course, like the power maybe goes out or something like that, but that would be very rare overall. But of course, like anything, if you go in and you do a lab study, it's not necessarily like something that you're doing typically in real life. And so it really just sort of depends on what the researchers are studying and whether or not they should be able to generalize out of the lab. But in terms of this general question, like, does the artificiality of the lab limit the ability to generalize results? And I would say, yes, of course it does. And again, especially if you're trying to study something like as it typically happens in the real world, and it's just a very artificial version of that in the lab, then like you should be very careful trying to generalize. But a lot of psychologists, maybe they study things and they say that I don't really care if this generalizes outside of the lab, because generalization is not the goal. Like, I'm trying to maybe just focus on understanding causality in terms of certain relationships, or maybe I'm trying to understand like neural mechanisms within the brain, and it doesn't matter if they're doing some sort of artificial task because I'm not trying to generalize. And again, I sort of think that this is a big limitation of psychological research, and so I don't really want to defend it too much, but except to say that just it depends a lot on what people are studying. And then perhaps most importantly, like, you can always do 2 things in the same research article. So you can do a lab experiment and a field study, and that's a really much better way of sort of showing that whatever you're studying is truly sort of a real effect in the world. And so field study could just be something where, like, yeah, you go do a survey of employees working for a company and you compare that to how college students did an experiment. And so this is what I was referring to earlier when I asked the class what was internal validity. But generally speaking, field studies tend to have better external validity because you're studying things as they are in the world, but they tend to have weaker internal validity because you have less sort of control over the variables, and you're not able to do like a manipulation to see exactly sort of cause and effect. So in terms of some things that you could do to improve external validity, so improving the ability to generalize, one of the most important things is something that we've already talked about in class. We talked about this, it'll actually be on exam 2 a little bit, because in survey research, we talked a lot about sampling methods. And basically this is sort of a general principle that's always true, and that if you use a random sampling technique, so something that enables you to sort of, if you have enough people anyway, you'll any sort of differences across the population will average each other out, and you'll end up with a very representative sample of the broader population. It's always better than using like a non-random sample, and a non-random sample, like the most sort of common example is called convenience sampling, which is what I talked about with psychology sort of over relying on college students, where they're just the most convenient. but it's not like a random sample of the population by any means. So it's always better to have, yeah, a random sample that is representative, and that's going to improve external validity like 100% every time. It's also, I think it's important to think about generalization as something that it's maybe not always the goal to show that some sort of effect generalizes, but sometimes you're interested in studying what are called interaction effects. This is also a review that we talked about a few weeks ago, where basically like an interaction effect would occur when a relationship between two variables differs depending on a third variable. And so you would have, like, under different conditions of the third variable, the relationship between those two other variables might flip from like sort of positive to negative, or from positive to like a null relationship, something like that. So as one example of an interaction effect, so disagreeableness, so the extent to which like you disagree with other people as like a personality trait, is positively associated with income for men. So as a man, like you can sort of get career benefits from being disagreeable, but it's actually negatively related to income for women. And so the sort of explanation there is that it sort of has to do with gender roles, and there is like, I think, a double standard for women, and that like women are often really expected to be kind of cooperative and altruistic, and if they don't behave in those sort of stereotypically feminine ways or have those traits, then that can be like, they can be viewed more negatively, even though sometimes like being able to disagree and assert your opinion is an important thing to do in one's career. And so I think men tend to have it a little easier, in that, yeah, they're not held to that sort of double standard, and that's why disagreeableness can sort of have benefits for men. But that's just one example of an interaction effect where, again, so here it's the relationship between disagreeableness and income, which differs depending on one's gender. So replication studies are one of the best ways to ensure generalizability. There are two main types of replication studies that you could do. So there's what's called an exact replication, which is where you, as a researcher, you try to do exactly everything the same as another researcher did. So if you remember that video we watched about the conformity, it was called the ASH conformity experiences or experiment. And basically these participants like were brought into a lab, and there was a bunch of sort of actors or confederates that were intentionally sort of saying the wrong line. And then they would see how people change their answers to conform with the group. So you would try to basically do that exact experimental method just with a new sample. And that's what an exact replication is. And the main advantage of that is that like you can see if it like was something uniquely about the experimenter that was influencing the results, or just like maybe it was something that had to do with the population the sample was drawn from. So if you have a new population that you're drawing from, maybe you don't find the same thing, even if you do everything exactly the same in the study. So that's the advantage of exact replications. There's also what are called conceptual replications, where you would alter the experimental procedures in some way to sort of see like, does the research finding like sort of generalize to some slightly different conditions. So if you were doing a conceptual replication of the conformity experiment, you could use like fruits rather than lines, in terms of like, you'd still have a group of actors like saying the wrong answer, but it wouldn't just be like, it wouldn't be through lines. It would be, you have to like say like, which of these fruits is similar to the one I'm showing, something like that. So Conceptual application is sort of just trying to broaden a little bit what you're focusing on and see whether or not the study findings generalize a bit to different experimental procedures. Literature reviews can also be used to evaluate the generalizability of a study. So I think if you're, in terms of writing your research proposals, by the way, literature reviews are a great place to start in terms of figuring out what's already been done on a particular topic. And if you find a literature review, I mean, that's what I would look for first when you are searching for articles. And then you can also like find the articles that are cited in a literature review. You can go look up those articles, and then very quickly you'll end up with 5 articles if you do that. But basically, yeah, literature review is just, it's a sort of a summary and critical evaluation of a bunch of studies on a particular topic. Most studies also, like, even if it's not a literature review directly, it's an empirical study, they should have like some element of a literature review within the introduction of their paper, because whenever you're writing a research paper, like you'll be doing for the 4th writing assignment, you have to sort of base your study on what's already been done and not just like pretend that there's nothing else that's already been done on your topic. So there's always some element of a literature review in a paper, but there are some articles that are specifically that. So a literature review, one main focus is just summarizing what's been found in previous studies. Also, like, the better sort of literature reviews are trying to be not just summarizing, but really sort of critically evaluating research on a particular topic. And in doing so, you might kind of sort of examine, yeah, whether some findings are more strongly supported than others, and that there's maybe been more studies that show this, and those studies had larger sample sizes or something like that. You point out any inconsistent findings, and you discuss directions for future research, which may be based on the fact that there are inconsistent findings. And so you might like suggest ways in which researchers could sort of test which of these inconsistent findings is more supported, things like that. So another type of literature review is what's called a meta-analysis. I've also sort of talked about this a few times throughout class, but not really necessarily formally. But so just to define a meta-analysis, it's a type of literature review where you, as a researcher, you actually combine the results of a bunch of studies and then you sort of analyze them all together. So you go through each article and you take out numbers from them, and you sort of compile them into an Excel spreadsheet, and then you can analyze all of those numbers together. And so the numbers that you're typically picking from articles are what are called effect sizes, which we've also talked about several times in this class. And effect size is basically just it's a standardized like value that can be compared across studies, because it means the same thing regardless of what's being measured or the scale in which things are being measured and things like that. So the two most common types of effect sizes are correlations and d-values. And so correlations we've talked a ton about in this class. It just reflects basically the strength of the relationship between two variables. And then a d-value is just like a mean difference between variables. It's very similar to like the t-tests that we were talking about last week. And oftentimes when you run like a t-test, you get a d-value, and that's the sort of standardized unit that you could compare across studies. Just as an example of like what a meta-analysis might find, I'll show the results on the next slide of a meta-analysis that looked at the relationship between weight and self-esteem. So essentially what you'll see in this table here are effect sizes, which are correlations that are averaged across all the sort of studies that the researchers could find that looked at this correlation between weight and self-esteem. So here's the, if you just focus on this top row here, this is the overall relationship. So averaged across all the studies, what's the overall correlation between weight and self-esteem? So that's negative 0.18. So that's what we consider to be a fairly weak correlation, but still like it's not zero. And it's negative. So that means that with people, like essentially the more you weigh, the lower self-esteem on average. If you, and then basically all these other sort of rows are just sort of moderator effects, or looking for interactions. So whether or not the relationship between weight and self-esteem differs depending on whether or not you're measuring weight through people's actual weight or their self-perceived weight. So we can see that it's actually a much stronger relationship if you just ask people like their perceived weight than actually if you weigh them directly. Across gender, so we can see that the relationship between weight and self-esteem is slightly stronger for females than it is for males. And also across socioeconomic status, where there's a larger sort of difference such that like there's a stronger negative relationship between weight and self-esteem for people from higher socioeconomic statuses than from lower ones. So these are the sorts of things that you could do in a meta-analysis, and you're sort of getting these effect sizes that you're getting are, again, they're averaged across many studies, which should mean that they're more likely to sort of generalize to the population than the results from any single study on its own. So this is the main review for today. I think I'm not really going to cover all these points because I just talked about them, but you'll have it on the slides here. And I guess another thing just to say real quickly that wasn't directly mentioned, but this is the main important distinction between like a narrative literature review. It's a type of qualitative research method that you're not like using numbers necessarily, just summarize things in words, whereas a meta-analysis is a quantitative literature review because you actually take the numbers or effect sizes from existing studies and analyze them together. But that's the review. Let's take a 5-minute break here, and then we'll end class with the take-home messages. So can come back at 10:55 and we'll get started again. All right, so if everyone could come back to your screen for a final time here. We have like probably just about 15 minutes or even less of things to cover for the take-home messages from class. So having taken many college classes myself and thinking back on what I really remember from them, it's kind of like you don't obviously remember everything, but sometimes ideally you remember a few things anyway. And so I think as the instructor of this class, these are probably the four most important things that are kind of fundamental concepts that we've talked about in different ways in this class. And if you can understand these four things, I'll be happy in terms of what you can bring to the other psychology classes or just other classes you take in college, and then of course the rest of your life. So I'm going to talk about each of these points on a separate slide. But the first one is what we talked about a little bit today, and just like is a general way of thinking about studies, and that you either have sort of two main methods, like you're looking at experimental data or correlational data. And so almost, yeah, you could go through every study published in psychology, and probably 95% you could classify as one of these two things. And the big difference, which really should be a review that we've talked about many times in this class, is just that experiments involve a manipulation of an independent variable, and that you typically sort of set up in experiments that you have control over. So you're manipulating something that you have control over, and then you can study its effect on other variables. For correlational studies, there's no manipulation. So you're sort of studying things as they are in the real world. The sort of main two most common types of correlational methods are surveys and then archival research. And if you remember, archival research is just like you use existing data. And so some of the work that I've done, for example, like we do surveys and we merge archival data that we get from like national registries and connect that to people's survey records, things like that. But the main thing is that you're asking people questions, but you're not like manipulating a variable. And so because of that, you have less control and less ability to kind of directly study cause and effect. But it's much easier to sort of to collect large data sets that are from people in the real world and that reflect like real world data in some sort of way, like people's income levels or their job performance or things like that. And all of these things would support generalizability. So that's take-home message number one. Again, just make sure you know the difference between an experiment and a correlational study, and I'll be happy. The second take-home message we talked about sort of, especially at the early part of class. I haven't revisited it for a while, but the main thing, especially with psychology research, is that we're sort of studying things that are going on in people's brains or in their bodies. And for the most part, like we can't really directly observe them. I mean, it is possible to sort of like look at someone and guess how happy they are, but you don't really know how happy they are. And you're, the best way to find out like how satisfied someone is with their life is to ask them. So we have to sort of figure out ways to measure variables that we can't directly observe. And ultimately sort of the quality of a measure of any sort of psychological trait is going to depend on the number of items. And the number of items just means like the number of questions that you use. Generally speaking, like more items are better because you get more reliability for whatever you're assessing. There's obviously like a certain point where if I'm trying to assess someone's like extroversion levels, I probably don't need like 20 items to assess that. I can assess it reasonably in like 10, and that would be like about as good as you can get for extroversion. But more items are generally speaking better, obviously up to a certain point. What those items are actually measuring is another really important thing. So I guess caveat to what I just said is that if I have more and more items, but they get like further and further away from how we actually define extroversion, then my measure is getting worse with more items. And so you need to make sure that like each item is mapping onto the theoretical construct, which is what we called like construct validity early on in class, and that you sort of develop questions to ask about a particular trait by really sort of talking to subject matter experts and really understanding the trait in depth in all of the different ways it can show up. You also need to like assess things that people can accurately respond to. And so for personality, for example, there's this long-standing debate where like, do people really know their personality, or is personality more so like things that we observe about other people? And so if we, if you ask someone like how, stick with extroverts and say like, how extroverted are you? Like someone's self-perception of that might be different than like how their friends or work colleagues perceive them. And some things can be harder to remember. Like if you start getting very specific and ask like, what were you thinking about yesterday at 4 p.m.? Like people don't remember that. And so whatever you're trying to measure about like things in the past, like you have to be really thoughtful in terms of like how far can you expect people to think back about their lives. And then with some measures we could use like not just self-reports, but other people report. So sometimes it's to answer that question of like, is your personality more so like how you perceive yourself or how others perceive you? You can assess that in a research study where you have like your roommate or your close friend report about your personality, and you could see like which better predicts real world outcomes between your self-reported personality and how other people perceive your personality. So that's take home number 2. And it's something that can be sometimes hard to assess unless you really read a study carefully, but yeah, it's critical. So take home message 3, sampling matters. This one we've talked about really a ton, and we talked about it again today. So I don't have that much more to say about it, but just the sort of general principle that we should trust results from studies that have larger, more representative samples. And anytime you hear something that's sort of like a surprising finding or something that seems like really counterintuitive, and you find out from like reading the sort of clipping that there's like 20 people who participated in the study or something like that, you can probably just ignore it. And like you really need a lot of people to be able to truly trust a study. And it would depend on what you're studying, exactly how many people, but this small n just means like a small sample size. This n just stands for sample size. And so if it's a correlational study, there should be at least 100 people before you would pay any attention to what they found. And if it's an experiment, it's okay to have fewer people, but maybe like 40, I would say, something like that. So that matters. And that is sometimes something that you can see without necessarily having to read the whole article, just like in a press clipping or something like that. And then finally, the 4th take-home message from this class has to do with consuming research and sort of how much trust should we have in the research findings that you sort of see or exposed to on the internet or the news, however you access information. And I think it's really important to say just that like our society depends on science and the scientific method and scientific principles in truly like more ways than you can count. All the technology that we use, all the sort of systems that we have in place that keep our very complex society sort of running are in some way based in principles of science. But the difficulty is just that like sometimes there are like poorly designed studies or studies where people make up data. I think that's much much rarer than the examples of good science, but sometimes, yeah, like bad research does get labeled as science, and it's hard. It can be hard, again, unless you're really like an expert and are reading a lot of papers in a particular area, to know, like, be able to tell the good from the bad. And in psychology, I mentioned this earlier today, there was this sort of replication crisis that happened in the early 2010s, where like study showed that, like, again, it was only like 1/3 of findings replicated, which is way lower than it should be. And it was not all psychology studies. It was especially sort of focusing on social psychology and lab experiments. And those are the sort of studies where oftentimes it's like some sort of surprising and counterintuitive finding. And so there's a whole host of reasons why that sort of happened. This is what was covered in, by the way, like your second writing assignment when you watched that John Oliver clip and then read that article. And so it's not just in psychology, it's really sort of in all different areas of research in which there are sometimes like bad incentives that sort of create this bad science and make it more common than it needs to be. But so one of the, I think, the best outcome of this whole replication crisis in psychology anyway is that, well, yeah, there were a lot of debates and people pointing fingers at each other and things like that. But ultimately, like, it led to some clear improvements in terms of like expectations for reporting research results, what you need to do to run a study, to get it published in a good journal, things like that ultimately are going to lead to sort of a better accumulation of generalizable knowledge. And so that's good. And I think the main sort of take home here from everything that I've said on this slide is just that, like, we should, as a society, like, trust science and trust in experts, and especially like the consensus opinion of experts. But that you shouldn't trust everything that you read. And again, it's those sort of findings that seem surprising or counterintuitive, where you really need to see more evidence for to be able to trust them. So that is all that I have for class today. So I'll end with this Michael Scott quote. And I will say that, yeah, so teaching this class online and not being able to see many people's faces has kind of been a unique experience, but I think it's worked out pretty well. And I do hope that, yeah, like, some of you people will, yeah, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be certainly on email. I'm actually moving to a different university next fall. So I'm moving to Michigan State University, which is kind of, it's the same job, but just a different school. And I'm
Why?
certainly miss Houston a lot, but I'll be on email, and you can always look me up and email me. And like I've sort of said throughout, I'm happy to answer questions about sort of careers in psychology more generally, things like that. So don't hesitate to reach out. We'll end with a final poll here. So 4 questions.
What made you like leave UH? Why are you changing the universities? If you don't mind me asking.
I cannot hear anyone if if you're saying something, so maybe are you on mute? Or actually, I think that was because my sound was off, so that would be the reason I wasn't able to hear. So sorry about that if you were trying to communicate with me, but I can probably hear you now.
No, I was like, if you don't mind answering, like, why are you changing universities? Like, no reason or just like,
Oh,
you
good
know.
question. Part of it is, well, I'm from Chicago originally, and so Michigan State is closer to sort of my family in Chicago, and that's a big part of it. And then the other part is in my particular program, like industrial organizational psychology, Michigan State has one of the top programs in the country, and so it's kind of a bit of an upgrade. I think University of Houston also has a really good program too, but it's not quite the same, at least in terms of like how it's viewed nationally. So those are the two main reasons anyway. I'm sorry if I missed any other questions throughout class. All right, I'm going to end this poll. There's 2 people who still need to reply. I'll give you 5 more seconds.
We have class next Tuesday, right?
We do not have class next Tuesday. The Monday is the last day of class, and then I think Tuesday is like sort of just a day off, and then presumably finals start on that Wednesday. So this is it in terms of meetings, and like I said, your attendance grade will also be finalized after today, but it'll take us a few days anyway to sort of compile everything. So this poll was really just designed to make sure that you know when things are due, and if you completed the questions, you should know. But yeah, so remember, exam 2 is going to open on Thursday morning. You could take it at 12:01 a.m. if you want, but I would recommend waiting till at least like 7 a.m. Make sure you complete it by Sunday night, and then make sure you complete the 4th writing assignment by the following Sunday night, and you can get it done early if you want. Again, email me if you have questions about it. And the final answer, which most people got right, was that writing assignment 4, is worth more points for your final grade. So the exams are ultimately worth a relatively small part of your grade in this class, only like 20% total. So the writing assignments are worth more, and if that helps you sort of plan in terms of how you should spend your time, then that's good. So that's all I've got. So everyone is free to go, and otherwise, yeah, it's really been a pleasure to work with all of you. So like I said, hope to hear from some of you in some ways. Otherwise, good luck finishing up the semester and all your other classes.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck.
Thank you.